All right. Gaza ceasefire, day 18. And it's not goodbye, you guys. It's not goodbye. But as far as the sit reps go, I would say I'm hoping that this is going to be the last one. Um, so a bunch of things I want to do in this last ceasefire. Hopefully some of you, 50,000 of you, um, our closest friends, thanks to Rania Kalik, may have caught one of the debriefing videos that I did with Rania. I kind of put my thoughts together about what we can learn from the war for Rania's show on Breakthrough News. In case I kind of operate on the assumption that everybody who knows about me knows about Rania Kalik. She's a much bigger deal than I am. But if you haven't seen that video, it's Breakthrough News, lessons learned from the Gaza war, something like that. But a few of the things that I said in that video, I want to elaborate on a little bit, and I think I can go a little bit more methodically through it in this format rather than an interview format because I can do it more like a lecture, um, my natural genre, which I've had to get back to now. So let me do that. Let's start. I want to remind people why I even started this channel because this channel was my YouTube channel. I did media work before the Gaza war, and I wrote and I blogged and I had a podcast. And so I had all of these things. I had all of this infrastructure in place, and I was fundamentally a Palestine guy. Uh, in for a few decades before this current genocide, but I focused laser like on this issue for the past year and a half for I think pretty much obvious reasons. But the specific reasons that I did military analysis and strategic analysis of the kind that I focused on was because I thought that that was an important part of the story. It was where I believed the issue was going to be decided, as I said over and over again in those exact words. And I used to, if you go back to the early sit reps, I said, this is a channel where I do military analysis that does not disdain Arab military capacities and that seeks to understand guerrilla warfare. And these were the two things that I didn't feel were adequately done by the military analysts that I was following, mostly Russia centric military experts, whether they were American or Russian or both. I didn't find that despite their knowledge of weapons and tactics and strategies, I didn't find that their historical knowledge was adequate, that their regional knowledge was adequate, or that their understanding of the societies, the nature of the conflict, the history of the conflict, the players involved, their agendas, I didn't think they understood any of that properly. And so I waited for a while for them to educate themselves. And when they kept coming up with answers that I didn't find adequate, I decided that I would have to do that work rather than try to go and find somebody who would do it for me. And of course, you guys, once again, I think everybody that knows about me also knows about John Elmer on the Electronic Intifada. And of course, they are, family to me, and kin, and they've always been doing it. They have the same approach. There's nothing you can't get here that you can get there, that you can get here that you can't get there. But this is also a game of volume. This is also a game of being out there as much as you can and producing as much as you can. And that's the game I was playing while the genocide went on, to claim every minute, to write every word. No thousand words goes unwritten. No minute of content goes unproduced while we could while we had the voices, while we had the keyboards, while we had the cameras, while we had the microphones. Okay. So that was why I did it, why I started it. And in terms of strategic concepts that I wanted to bring into into the conversation, things from other guerrilla theorists, like concepts of a war of attrition, a war of destruction, trying to make a long war or make a war short or make a war long, time, space, you know, the asymmetries of weaponry, the questions of social cohesion and will, and how the relationship of a military institution and a state to the society, to the economy, to the political economy, to the positionality in the global economy. All of these things are things that are necessary to bring in to understand what was going on. And so, with all of this in mind, I think I don't think it's too soon anymore to try to look back on the 470 days of the war and come to some overall, I guess I have to say conclusions, for want of a better word, about what we saw and what we learned from watching that war. So, you know that the um, everybody goes to Clausewitz, right? The theorist of war, the European theorist of war from Prussia, who analyzed Napoleon and Frederick the Great and talked about war as a continuation of policy, politics by other means. This is the kinds of some of the refrains you always heard about the how you can only analyze a war in terms of the objectives of the political objectives ultimately of the combatants. But long before Clausewitz, there was Sun Tzu, right? You guys have all heard of the. I'm studying Chinese now, but I've never yet learned how to pronounce Sun Tzu. I will probably soon now that I've had to say it, but you guys know the spelling. It's usually spelled with the old way, not pinyin, but Wade Giles, I think, S-U-N and then T-Z-U. That's not how things are spelled now with pinyin. But I don't know even how to say Sun Tzu in pinyin. I'll have to look that up. Not today. But Sun Tzu said the order of priority for how you attack an enemy is first you attack his plans, then you attack his alliances, then you attack his armies, and only then do you attack fortified cities. And so, if you watch the Al Jazeera documentary that came out a little bit after the ceasefire, What is Hidden is Greater is the English translation of it. You see from Hamas's perspective, the October 7th was an attack on Israel's plans. They view it as a preemption. They said there was a big plan to do major bombing campaigns in Gaza to assassinate all the major leaders of the resistance in Gaza. Uh, the Hamas announced, Abu Ubaidah announced that Mohammed Deif had been killed during the war in battle, just like Yahya Sinwar. So those two major leaders from that generation have died, although some leaders are going to be coming out of prison in the prisoner swap, apparently, as the ceasefire moves forward, if it indeed moves forward, which it very well might. So, and you can see what kind of plan Israel was trying to do based on what they did in Lebanon, right? And indeed what they did in Gaza, but the dropping these massive bunker buster bombs on civilian areas based on whatever intelligence and the kind of permissiveness they were able to achieve from the West was the plan. So the way they assassinated, the way they, you know, assassinated implies almost like sneaking around like a ninja. They dropped 80 tons of bombs on a civilian area to kill Hassan Nasrallah from the Secretary General of Hezbollah, and they did the same kinds of things to try to kill the Hamas leaders. They destroyed 90% of the buildings of Gaza, claiming that they were doing that to try to kill these leaders. But Hamas had some kind of intelligence. They had some sense of these plans, and they attacked on October 7th to attack their plans. And in that priority, plans, attacking the enemy's plans is the highest thing you can do. And the lowest thing you can do is to attack their fortified cities. And that's what Israel did. They went straight to trying to attack the fortified city of Gaza, well, several cities within Gaza, the so-called Gaza Strip. So let's debrief the war in terms of all of the combatants, in terms of what they were trying to do, and we can make some kind of evaluation. So, October 7th was initiated by Hamas, um, and what they wanted to do was capture some Israeli military VIPs and trade them for the thousands of Palestinian prisoners. That was the intent of the operation. They were trying to break out of Gaza. They wanted to they must have known several of the things that Israel was going to do. I think they they had prepared very well for not just an Israeli ground invasion, but a long ground invasion from Israel, because they were able to fight and they continued to have weapons and they continued to be in their tunnels and their attack positions and lay these ambushes, command and control, communications, all of that. They managed to continue unbroken throughout 16 months of genocidal assault. So they had made preparations for a ground war with Israel, an invasion of Gaza, and they what they wanted though was to capture these Israeli military figures, trade them for Palestinian prisoners inside Israeli prisons, and to end the siege of Gaza through military means. So remember, Israel is starving Gaza before October 7th. Israel is suffocating Gaza. They're not letting people come in and out. They're trying to ramp down the caloric intake of Gaza. They hadn't destroyed all the buildings, but they were holding that ability over the people of Gaza and they're over their heads. They're also, we'll tell you more. I'll talk more about what their long-term objectives are and were, but these were what Hamas was trying to do. That's what they said they were trying to do. It's what they've constantly repeated that they were trying to do. And you can see that this is what they were trying to do because these were their terms for a ceasefire. They said if you want a ceasefire, you have to end the whole war, you have to end the siege, you have to return our prisoners at some huge rate of many Palestinian prisoners for every Israeli military captive. So that was their objective. Shortly after October 7th, the day after, indeed, Hezbollah from Lebanon, the resistance organization that has also fought Israel, which has invaded Lebanon over and over again, and Hezbollah evolved as an organization to fight Israel's invasions of Lebanon. And Israel always invades the south first because that's the first place they get to. And Hezbollah is the organization of the people of the south of Lebanon. So, what Hezbollah wanted to do, again, declared objectives of their Secretary General from his first speech several weeks after October 7th, was to support Gaza. They created this concept of a support front to draw Israeli soldiers away from Gaza, so they were not available to fight the Palestinians in Gaza, to keep the conflict sub-threshold, also to destroy a lot of Israel's grown, developed surveillance infrastructure. So Israel was had developed the same way they had developed a whole bunch of surveillance infrastructure for Gaza that Hamas was also very interested in disrupting and destroying. On October 7th, Hezbollah also began to target the surveillance equipment, the surveillance bases, their firing position, the advanced kind of firing positions of Israel that they were kind of holding over as a threat of invasion to Hezbollah. So they wanted to degrade Israel's ability to invade Lebanon and to support um, Gaza. And Nasrallah said that they were prepared to make sacrifices, that they made many sacrifices. And of course, they did make unbelievable sacrifices, so much so that people in Gaza were saying, we're so grateful to you, but we wish, we wouldn't have wanted this if we knew that this, that you would have had to sacrifice so much to support Gaza. But Nasrallah's declared objective was a ceasefire in Gaza with Hamas remaining in power. So if that was the objective that Nasrallah set, ultimately Hezbollah did support Gaza. They did degrade Israel's abilities to invade Lebanon. They did damage Israel's ability to surveil and invade ultimately Lebanon, which they did, and I'll get to that in time. They did not succeed in keeping it sub-threshold. Short of total war, Israel did end up attacking Lebanon in an all-out kind of way. But as far as that main objective that Nasrallah set out and said, we are working towards winning a ceasefire on Hamas's terms that leaves Hamas in power. And that is what happened. That is what ended up happening. So what Hezbollah was doing, what Hezbollah achieved is what they set out to do. They were trying to support, they always recognized that this was Hamas's fight, and they were supporting it, and they supported it, and it was achieved what they believed was their objective. Ansar Allah in Yemen joined with the taking of the Galaxy Leader, and what they emphasized was that this was a siege for a siege. So if while Gaza's besieged, Israel's going to be besieged. And they kept expanding. They expanded into other seas. Beyond the Red Sea, they fought many naval battles with the United States Navy. They took many, many, many bombing runs from the Americans and from the Israelis, and they gave as good as they got, and they kept hitting Tel Aviv with the Yafa drone, with the Falastine 2 missile. They made Eilat port more or less defunct. And they have basically ramped it down now, but they said we're still going to target Israeli ships and we're going to monitor very closely. So the ceasefire negotiations have future phases. We're now headed for phase two and phase three, which are supposed to end the siege of Gaza and have a massive reconstruction. So if that doesn't happen, these, you know, as Yemen says, their fingers are on the trigger. So I would say that from their perspective, from Ansar Allah's perspective, they also paid huge costs. They also were devastated by all these bombing runs. But the leader of Ansar Allah, Syed Abdul Malik al-Houthi, he said their capacities, their military capacities actually improved over the course of the year and a half by necessity. They were facing the US Navy, they were facing these advanced anti-aircraft, anti-missile systems in Israel. And so they had to adapt and they had to defeat them. And they did defeat them. And they defended and survived all of this bombing raids. And they're still there. And they're still ready to support if things return back to war. Iran, behind the scenes um, supporter, arms, finance, everything that these resistance units have, and especially in Lebanon, the Hezbollah and Ansarullah in Yemen, and Iran has supported all of that. But they support it in this, they have a specific methodology of trying to support in a way that creates self-sufficiency among the resistance. And their goals seem to have been to stop the genocide. Uh, and I think they had a very vigorous approach at the beginning before the President Raisi was assassinated. I think he was assassinated. Um, and they took them, they calibrated their approach. I think they wanted to avoid direct involvement, but they ended up getting directly involved and having two big salvos of missiles, which they launched on Israel, and again learned a lot about Israel's missile defense, and also, um, I think, showed that there are many possibilities for escalation on their side that they didn't necessarily want to use, but they could in the event of an expansion of war to Iran. So I would say if one of their goals was to not get directly involved, they ended up having to be directly involved. There were some real blows, like the assassination of Raisi, probably the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh while he was a guest of theirs at the funeral of Raisi. So they took some big hits. Of course, the assassination of Nasrallah in Lebanon was also, I think, a big hit to Iran too. And you know, they're still facing possible war from America. So they're in a continued kind of precarious position, and they had to handle it very carefully. And I think they were very careful. They were very cautious. And I wouldn't say that they declared objectives as explicitly as Hezbollah did, because they were they were saying we we're here to support the resistance, not they didn't want to become a belligerent in the war in that way, and and I suppose they didn't become a belligerent in that war in that way, because that's had they presumably had they joined, that would have been the war with the US too. And so trying to avoid a war with the US while ensuring that Gaza doesn't fall, while ensuring that the ceasefire ends with Hamas in power, as Nasrallah declared. If that's the case, if those were the broad lines of what they wanted, I guess they also achieved what they wanted. And arguably, they didn't follow through with the third missile launch because the Gaza ceasefire happened while they were still deciding whether to do it or not. Okay, well, what about another member of the anti-Israel coalition, which was Assad, the Syrian regime of President Assad? which had as probably its main goal to survive and as its secondary goal to support the resistance against Israel, and then maybe a tertiary goal to kind of get back and reconstruct and get their country back on track. So none of those were successful. They were very much stabbed in the back by Turkey, who I'll get back to. And the huge stab in the back from Turkey, and to a lesser extent the Arab allies that they were trying to get in their good graces, led to the fall of the Syrian regime. And so now we have a ISIS regime in Syria, which is a disaster for the Syrian people and a disaster for its allies and a disaster for the world and a disaster for the Americans probably too in the making. So, and the Israelis who are occupying half of Syria. So that one was a very unpredicted thing, a surprise, a real surprise that followed the Lebanon ceasefire. And that's going to play out for years. There's going to be years. It's that it didn't start after the Lebanon ceasefire. It started at least in 2011, and it's going to keep playing out for a long time. One other player that I think we should mention, or one or two, arguably, the kind of Western anti-war movement. Maybe you could also separate that out and add the Arab Street. You could also add the diplomats, the world's diplomats, the diplomatic corps that was trying to use the United Nations, international law to force the Western countries to stop supporting Israel, to force an arms embargo, to try to get an arms embargo, to try to get Security Council to call it off the way the Security Council called off previous wars, basically Lebanon wars, wars between Israel and Egypt, wars between Israel and Syria, all have been stopped by Security Council resolutions. Um, Security Council resolution was passed and ignored. So the Security Council was killed over this war as an effective force. International law was also discarded thanks to this war. It will never play a role in settling a conflict again, neither will the Security Council. That the consequences of that will also play out over the coming years. It could be major consequences for a long time. But um, I would say that the multipolar world order in the making that the Chinese and the Russians are trying to build, the anti-war movement that tries to use international law and nonviolent rallies and marches and show that society, the people are not behind genocide and force their governments to do things. I would say that all of that, I'm very sorry to say because I'm part of this. Um, Despite some good moments, some glorious moments we had, you guys, we did. We had a good run. I would say that we were pretty much a failure to affect the outcome here. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying, but I would say we overall um, didn't get the job done. The job we set out to do, because what we wanted was to stop the genocide, preferably before it started, and use all of these instruments that supposedly existed to prevent genocide. Like the whole United Nations was supposed to prevent genocide. Like we were supposed to be able to use mass mobilization to stop genocide. That's what we would have wanted to be able to say that we could do. All of these things that we have, like the media focusing on genocide, trying to make it a political issue. So yeah, that didn't go so well for us, I'd say. Okay, what about the other side? What about Team Genocide? Team Genocide, the Axis of Assistance, as the Cradle called them. What did they want? How did they do? I would say let's start with the United States of America, the Biden administration, the Kamala Harris. campaign, the Trumps, they wanted to remove Hamas from power. They wanted to stop the Yemen support front. They wanted to remove Hezbollah from power. So, in terms of those objectives, it was a total shutout. They didn't succeed in any of them. Um, Egypt, okay, Egypt, which broadly speaking, what they did didn't make Israel happy, but they certainly were trying to keep the US happy and keep them on side. But the Egyptian regime wanted to stay in power, like the Syrian regime did, and they wanted to not lose a huge chunk of their territory, the Sinai Desert, to Israeli occupation, which was one of Israel's goals. They wanted to use the Gaza war to displace the people of Gaza to the Sinai and then take over the occupation of the Sinai from Egypt. And so if Egypt wanted to not have those things happen. Egypt had fairly conservative goals, and I'd say they met them. They are still in power and they didn't lose Sinai. So they're winning. Jordan, the king of Jordan didn't want to be overthrown by the Jordanian population over this, and he wasn't, so he's still there. And he didn't want to be overthrown by the Israelis, because he was not doing their bidding. And he hasn't been overthrown by the Israelis either. So, so far, so good for the Jordanian regime. Turkey wanted to look like they were doing something for the Palestinians, and they wanted to grab whatever they could. They managed to grab Syria. So I'd say they're winning. They stay winning. As Trump noted that Turkey was a big beneficiary of what happened and not the US. Um, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, what about them? Some of these other Gulf states. I think they wanted to help the Israelis. They wanted to potentially help the Israelis destroy Hezbollah and Hamas and any other enemies that they might have. They didn't want to really commit too hard to that, and they didn't want to antagonize Yemen too much. And it's the over antagonizing Yemen would lead to Yemen destroying their oil infrastructures, which underpin the global economy. And so they were constrained in how much they could support Israel by that factor and among others. And so they managed to do that. They managed to more or less stay out of it, offer a little bit of support to Israel without over antagonizing the alliance, the resistance allies. So they stay winning. Israel. Israel wanted to get rid of Hamas. They failed. They wanted to get out of this war without ever recognizing Palestinians and make no deals. This is one of their really important principles. They failed. They wanted to get rid of Hezbollah, obviously failed. They wanted to try to get the US to destroy Iran for them, that Iran war that they badly want. So far, nope. Dice, no dice there. And then, of course, long term, they want to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They want to build a temple there. They want to expand settlements. They want to bring more Jewish settlers. They want to restrict Palestinians onto smaller lands and commit more genocide. So all of these goals, they're still in play, but they had an idea that they might be able to advance these goals in a big way during this war, and that did not pan out for them. So now there's a specific thing to say that I said to Rania too on Ranya's show. To those people, and I saw it in the Electronic Intifada comments last week when I was watching the stream, to those who say, well, Gaza's destroyed and 100,000 people or more have been killed and another 100,000 wounded, so that's the resistance lost. You can't say they won because of these costs. Now, my answer to that is, look, the Anglo-Americans have been fighting this way for hundreds of years. Okay, there's a book I mentioned in this sit rep many times called The First Way of War. The First Way of War, Cambridge University Press. American War Making on the Frontier by John Grenier. He's from the United States Air Force. It's a 2012 book. Read it, you'll read and understand how the Americans have always fought these so-called Indian wars, the wars against indigenous peoples. They always go straight to attacking the civilians. They attack the women, they attack the children, they kill women and children, they commit genocide, they destroy food sources, they try to starve people. That is the first way of war. That is the Zionist way of war because Zionism is this Protestant ideology. The Bible tells us that we take the land, we destroy all of the unbelievers and the Amalek, and the Americans were motivated by this exact ideology when they were committing the genocides of the Americas, and the Zionists, the Jewish Israeli Zionists, are no different today. The ideology, the methodology is hundreds of years old, but it's the but genocide is always a means to an end, just like any other way of doing war. So the Russians have their own way of doing ground war and attrition and destroying very specific tactics, even of applying pressure on all the fronts, and they call it their operational art. So Russians have a way of doing things. China has always had a very unique and distinctive way of thinking about war and warfare. And Mao Zedong was a theorist of that, of warfare, and they've no doubt adapted it to modern technology and state to state warfare in their um, Chinese armies today. And Muslims and Islamic warfare, they have their own guidelines and especially a lot about ethics. However, you do war, the way that you do the war and the Anglo-American Zionist way is genocidal. However, you do it is a means to an end. The end is not the destruction. The end is compelling their terms on the enemy. So even the genocides of the Americas were to get treaties with indigenous nations that they then, of course, went back on. But they wanted to impose these treaties. They wanted to either try to destroy the political organization of these indigenous nations, committing what one Israeli sociologist, Baruch Kimmerling, called politicide, or they wanted to just compel them through this destruction and violence and terror into signing terms, signing away land and signing away rights to the settlers. So the destruction of these buildings is no more the goal than just that's like saying dropping bombs was the goal. So they dropped so many bombs and therefore they achieved their goal because dropping bombs was the goal. Dropping bombs is not the goal. Dropping bombs, destroying buildings is not the goal. The goal is the imposition of their will, their settlement on the Palestinians, and they did not impose their will. The ceasefire terms were the Palestinian terms. The ceasefire terms were what the Palestinians believed were achievable at the beginning. And so that's why we can only understand this as a law of loss for Israel and a victory for the resistance. A terrible cost was paid. It's always different when you have this kind of disparity between the powerful and the oppressed. The cost of victory is going to be higher than the cost of losing. And that's just the nature of the asymmetry. If it wasn't asymmetric like this, there would be no need to fight in the first place. So, okay. So that's how I would answer the idea that the destruction means the resistance lost. The destruction was a capacity that the Israelis always had, and they've used it now. They've used it, and very possibly, not not for sure, but they might have used it up. and spent what they have in a lot of ways. Maybe we'll see. Maybe they'll go back to war and I'll eat these words, but we'll see. But having said that, there's another question which we took up a little bit in Ranya's show, which is did Yahya Sinwar and did Hassan Nasrallah misjudge Israel? And I would say not really, no. They knew that they themselves could be martyred. They knew that the cost, one of Nasrallah's themes was that the cost of resistance is still, however high it is, it's lower than the price of submission. The price of submission is higher than the price of resistance. And Sheikh Naim Qasim, he's the new Secretary General of Hezbollah, and he was trying to say that too. He was like, "Did we lose? No, we don't have an unconditional victory. You can't have an unconditional victory against an opponent that's so much more powerful." But don't forget that disparity. Don't forget that disparity. What does it look like to win a victory against a vastly more powerful foe? It looks more or less like this. And what a loss would have looked like would have been much worse. Would have been much worse. Um, Given that, maybe we can let me just say one thing about Trump's announcements today. You guys are seeing that Trump said we got to get rid of all the people in Gaza and build something beautiful and blah, blah, blah. Um, if I've tried to tell you guys anything in these sit reps, it's that you don't watch the bloviating statements of these people. You watch the battlefield. That is where this issue will be decided. It's not settled in press conferences. It's not settled in bombastic statements. Watch what's happening on the ground. Watch that. The statements, unless they're translating into things, changes on the ground, they're just noise. So that's I'll leave that as my comment on Trump's uh, announcements today. So I wanted to say about the endurance. How did Gaza and how did the people of South Lebanon endure this genocidal onslaught? And I would say one of the lessons of this war is that while the armed resistance was absolutely integral to the survival of what the people that, what managed to survive, what we have left of Gaza is because of the armed resistance and likewise in South Lebanon. The non It's also the case that the non-violent society, the people power part of this equation, also defeated Israel. So Israel was trying directly, remember, to depopulate the south of Lebanon. And the people of Lebanon came back. They came back and they defied the Israeli army directly. So when the war was going on, Hezbollah fighters on the ground, sometimes massively outnumbered, massively outgunned, still nonetheless prevented Israel from advancing, which they said they didn't even expect. Naim Qassem said several times we didn't expect to be able to stop them. Our plan was always to retreat, like to fight a kind of a retreating battle and make them pay for every inch. They didn't even have to make them pay for every inch because they only took all those inches after the war, after the ceasefire. But the nonviolent society, the civil society, if you want, the people of South Lebanon also defeated the Israeli army by going back right in the face of the Israeli army. And the Israeli army was pushed out in several cases over the past week by the people of Lebanon. And likewise, the nonviolent resistance in Gaza, which was the target of the Israeli army, also defeated the Israeli military. Over and over again, the Israeli military would destroy a hospital, and then the Palestinians would go back and make that hospital work again. They would make the camps work again. The Israelis tried to interfere with aid distribution. They tried to get collaborators, gangsters. They tried to do all kinds of things to divide Palestinian society. And all of those were defeated not just by the armed resistance, but also by people making the country livable, making the society viable, despite all of the military attempts to destroy it. So while the armed resistance remained in the field at the end of the battle, they weren't going anywhere. It's also that this war should also be studied as a case of when the military tries to skip the step of defeating the armed resistance and goes and attacks the nonviolent, the unarmed people, the people also defeated them. And that's an incredible case study here to study. It's an incredible thing that happened here. And I don't think it should go unnoticed. I don't think it should go uncounted, and I don't think it should go uncelebrated because it's a remarkable thing to see an army try to skip the step of winning the war and go and attack the society, and only to have to simultaneously face ambushes at night and also an impossible to defeat society despite being unarmed during the day. It's an incredible story. So that also leads to the answer to the question of why Gaza and Lebanon endured is also related to why Israel accepted the ceasefire. And I don't think it was Trump. Okay, I'm going to say this right now. They want you to think it was Trump that made them do it. But I don't believe it was Trump that made them do it. I believe that it was Israel's army that was exhausted. And Israel's army is a popular army. It's a conscript army. It is an army of the people. The people love their army. The people are their army. And the things that that army was doing, whether it's killing children or dressing up in women's lingerie or um, posing for pictures while they blow up universities and mosques. These are all things that the society loves, that the Israeli society and the greater Western support base for Israel loves. They love it, um, and they support it. And 2 or 3% of them don't, and the rest do. And the rest who do have some debates over whether it works or not, very few, very little, but everybody supports it morally. And so the army reaching the point of exhaustion with not being able to impose their will, with fighting the same battles over and over again, with facing the same people who refuse to do what they're told over and over again, and with facing the same ambushes, bigger, sometimes growing bigger towards the end of the war. Casualties, wounded, attrition, no end in sight, no prospect of winning, no decisive blow, no knockout blow, just a trickle, 1,000 cuts. The army reaching that point of exhaustion means the society has reached that point of exhaustion. They've lost the feeling that they can win. And I've always believed that they have behaved in such inhuman ways. They are facing such revulsion from ordinary human beings that wherever they go, that the 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 ability of them of to mentally keep it together is also eroding. And so the question of whether the Israeli army will be able to renew itself for another round or rounds of war is also a question of whether the society can renew itself. And what's the basis of that society going to be? Because the basis they've generations of indoctrination have prepared them to do what they just did for a year and a half. It made them into these genocidal maniacs. But can a society of genocidal maniacs now, they are now the roots, they are now the seeds of whatever Israel's future is going to be. So is that society of genocidal maniacs going to be able to build a first-rate economy, a first-rate army, a first-rate society and educational system? Um, are they going to be able to attract the same levels of support from a West that may not have those resources relative to other countries and may not be able to draw on unlimited free uranium and things from Western Africa that they used to when France was their backer, or whatever Trump does with tariffs now that America's their backer. So the question of whether Israel is how spent Israel is, how much they'll be able to renew themselves now, that's these are open questions that are going to play out over the coming weeks, months. So, a couple of other observations before I conclude with what we can expect. One is about four or five more. Okay, so this was an asymmetric war, and it also was an asymmetric propaganda war. This was a war where all of the social media was under monopoly American control, and yet a little bit of plucky information warfare from Qassam, the Red Triangle videos, Abu Ubaida's speeches, and things like that. The Yemenis, Ansar Allah, they played the game too, and it went a long way. And I would say in this area, the anti-war movement also did pretty well. I'd say way above our weight. We punched way above our weight, and all of you, I want to thank all of you who were part of this community for that too. I think it really was, we had everything stacked against us and we did pretty well in that game. Um, I think the other thing is ethically speaking, and I said this on Ranya's show, the idea of laws of war, the ideas of how you conduct yourself in a war, that the West has abandoned that. There's no Geneva Conventions. There's no laws of war. Nobody in the West will ever have laws of war that anyone respects. The West, the people the West back in Israel or even in Ukraine or in Syria, they're, totally Nazified. They attack civilians first. It's terrorism. They attack women and children. They're proud of it. And they're genocidal. The Israelis are totally genocidal and they're embraced. So the only laws of war that we saw applied in this war were applied by the resistance side and they who didn't attack women and children. And I know this is a crazy thing to say in this propaganda environment, but um, you know, the facts bear this out. They didn't attack medevac, medical evacuation helicopters. They treated hostages or captives exceptionally well, especially compared to what the Israelis are doing. So all of these notions, when the Ansar Allah took over the crew, the crew of the Galaxy Leader, that ship, they've all gone back home, I believe. And the first thing they said was, "We're Muslim, and you will not be treated. You're going to be treated according to our Islamic principles." So, like, Islamic Islamic warriors' honor is basically the only warriors' honor in this war. And obviously, the ISIS people in Syria don't follow that or have that, but they are basically a Western proxy anyway, right? So that's one thing. the idea of like ethical warfare, the West has abandoned that. Um, and the resistance upholds it according to their own principles. Um, Israel eroded its own society. I mentioned that by embracing genocide, by embracing the Hannibal doctrine of killing their own people, if rather than risking them becoming prisoners, they committed. They've done a lot of damage to their own society, and I don't know how long. I don't know how the what the consequences are going to be, but I think they're going to also take years to play out. In terms of Israel's strategy, you remember the report from 2006 that went around when people were trying to assess how Israel was going to fight Hezbollah a second time. And they didn't go even as far, they didn't get even as far as they did in 2006. But this 2006 war, the lessons they learned were the lessons of doing the pager attack, right? More surveillance, more intelligence, more assassination, depopulation, and trying to do starvation. These were the lessons that they learned. It wasn't lessons about how to actually win a ground war or fight a ground war, but to be more flashy, more scary, more psychological warfare, try to induce collapse, right? This 5 generation warfare, try to induce the psychological collapse of your foe. Didn't work. It's not a successful paradigm. The idea of trying to win by genociding your enemy, trying to win by just spectacular assassination, trying to win by destroying every building. I think this paradigm has been proven unsuccessful. I don't know whether that lesson's going to be absorbed or not, but I think one of the tentative conclusions of this war should be that you try to win a war by skipping the stage of fighting the war and skipping to destroying the civilian infrastructure and killing the civilians, and you lose the war because the military force that you're trying to avoid is trying to get you. And when you come through, they do get you, and they get you in ambush after ambush, sniper attack after sniper attack, and close quarters battles like the Hezbollah war, the war that happened in 2024 between Hezbollah and the Israeli army was they all the if you read the reports, it's like point blank battles. Their tanks blow up from these missile systems that Hezbollah has, and then they are fighting in incredibly close quarters. A few Hezbollah usually against many Israelis. And the last thing is that there were several fronts that were opened against Israel. Yemen, the Red Sea front of Yemen, the Israeli north with Hezbollah, the Gaza front, and the West Bank too. And all of these, and Iraq, the Iraqi resistance also helped. The the Americans and the Israelis said, okay, we're going to go one by one and we're going to destroy each one. So they went to Yemen and they fought against Ansar Allah and they didn't stop Ansar Allah. They went to invade Lebanon with a whole bunch of divisions. They invaded Lebanon and they didn't, I mean, they got a ceasefire. They arguably they Hezbollah agreed to stop the support front in some way, although the Israelis are still there. Those divisions are still sort of stuck and bogged down there, but they they lost that war too, and then they went and lost in Gaza. So there was a successful separation of the fronts, but each front, rather than defeating each in detail, as the expression goes, they lost each battle. So that's an interesting dynamic. It wasn't a bad idea of theirs to try to separate the fronts, but it turned out that each individual front was strong enough to win on their own terms. And I guess, when we talk about the West Bank now, is in this position where they also very well might end up defeating Israel by themselves, just the way Gaza did or the way Hezbollah did. The West Bank now has their own battle. It's a very different kind of battle. It's a bigger space than Gaza was, but they are more penetrated. There's, the intelligence, there's the Palestinian Authority. So there's a whole bunch of totally different conditions. The West Bank wall, the nature of the wall. Um, there's a whole bunch of different conditions for sure. But they are finding their way. They're doing their own armed struggle, and they have their own political struggle, and that's the story. That's going to be the story that we watch, and you'll see John Elmer covering that too, as it advances in that part of the conflict, because now that's where we're headed. We're headed to the West Bank having its own battle with the Israelis, the same way these other fronts did. Now, what about the ceasefire? If I'm right, and if the Israelis are some kind of spent force, I think what we can expect is they will try to avoid going back to war, but they will also try to avoid having to implement the terms of the ceasefire and give back the prisoners and allow reconstruction and aid. So the whole question from the Israeli perspective is, can we avoid going back? Can we avoid fulfilling the terms of the ceasefire agreement without going back to war? Or can we go back to war in a way that doesn't um, commit us to spending these resources that are broadly speaking exhausted? There are in terms of their army and their morale and their willingness to fight and their sense that they can win. So can they avoid both? If they fight war again, the outcome will probably be the same. There's no reason to think that the outcome would be different if they keep doing what they've been doing. So how much can they prevent reconstruction, and how much can they reimpose the siege? And what's the will to do that in Israel, um, and in the U.S.? That's what we that those are the open questions as we move forward in this uh, time of this ceasefire. So with that, once again, I say it's not goodbye. I'm here. You can still hear plenty of. We're gonna go back to the podcast. We're gonna do interwar. Historically speaking, I'll still do the anti-empire report. So we'll still cover current events, including Palestine, in the coming time. I'll be writing on Substack. You can see my writing there. Maybe doing some big writing projects and, some books and other things that I planned to do before that I couldn't do. I've been away for a while from the camera because I've been trying to get my life back in order, you guys. This took a lot out of me. I'm not complaining. I was not suffering a genocide. But it was yeah, there are a lot of things that I have to try to address that were neglected. I'm sure a lot of you are going through the same thing. Again, it's obscene almost to complain about this given what we've been talking about and why we've been doing what we've been doing, but here we are, and so the sit reps, the therapy sessions, these were an extraordinary effort for an extraordinary time. I could not sustain them beyond the war's ending. But I will be in the usual places. I'll be writing more probably. I probably won't be talking straight to the camera. That was something that I mostly did only because of this. But we'll see, as I told Rania, you don't want to make any major life decisions. Maybe this period of sit reps made me hooked on YouTube. I do love reading your comments, you guys. That was really something meaningful to me over the past year, and this community means a lot to me, you guys. Um, it's been really, really extraordinary to have you guys, to post the video and then the next morning just to go through and read these really thoughtful, really, really insightful, and like I knew you guys were feeling the pain. I knew you guys were right here with me, and that was like it was really, really important. And I really appreciate it a lot. And we have this community now, and um, you know, we can support Gaza materially. We can do those fundraisers. We can do all of those things, and we can keep we can keep working. The people of Gaza think that of this as a victory, and so we should too. And as I said, I don't think it's our victory. I don't think we can claim it as the anti-war movement. I think that would be stolen valor. But if we keep working, maybe we'll have our day too, um, as the anti-war movement, maybe. So until then, you know what I'm gonna say, right? Until then, hang in there, everybody. And I'll see you out here on the internet, but probably not with this gray background and not in the sit rep series. I hope you guys yeah, I hope it was meaningful for you and the way it was for me. And yeah, take care, guys.